April 2nd, 1944. Hollandia, Dutch New Guinea. Japanese Army Air Force Captain Takeo Yamada stood at the edge of the jungle airstrip, watching mechanics refuel 3 Mitsubishi Ki-43 Oscar fighters parked beneath camouflage netting. The morning sun had barely cleared the Owen Stanley Mountains to the south, but already the heat was oppressive, the humidity thick enough to make breathing feel like work. Yamada commanded the 77th Sentai's detachment at Hollandia, one of 12 airfields the Japanese had carved from the jungle across this remote corner of New Guinea. These bases formed the backbone of Japanese air power in the southwest Pacific, staging points for operations against Allied forces pushing northward through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea's northern coast. The airfields were considered secure. Hollandia sat 560 miles northwest of the nearest Allied fighter base at Dobodura. No Allied single-engine fighter possessed the range to reach this far into Japanese-controlled territory and return safely. Even the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, with its reputation for long-range missions, couldn't threaten targets this deep without forward-staging bases that didn't exist. Or so Japanese intelligence assessments claimed. Yamada reviewed those assessments daily. They were explicit. The P-38's combat radius, the maximum distance it could fly, fight, and return, was approximately 450 miles with drop tanks. Hollandia was safely beyond that threshold by over 100 miles. The Americans might raid targets along the coast, but the inland bases were untouchable. This calculation shaped Japanese defensive deployments across New Guinea. Fighter strength concentrated at forward airfields near the combat zone, while rear area bases like Hollandia maintained minimal defenses. Why waste fighters protecting targets the enemy couldn't reach? At 0637 hours, Yamada heard the air raid sirens. His first thought was that someone had triggered a false alarm. The sirens were tested, weekly, always at dawn. But this wasn't a test day. He looked skyward, squinting against the rising sun, and saw nothing. Then the first bombs fell. They came from nowhere. No warning, no radar detection, no scout aircraft reports, just sudden, catastrophic violence erupting across the airfield. High-explosive bombs cratered the runway. Fragmentation clusters shredded parked aircraft. A fuel dump exploded in a fireball that incinerated everything within 100 yards. Yamada threw himself into a slit trench as the ground heaved beneath him. Through the chaos of detonations and screaming men, he caught a glimpse of the attacking aircraft. Twin-boom silhouettes, P-38 Lightnings. 8 of them, maybe 10, making repeated passes at low altitude, their nose-mounted cannons and machine guns tearing apart anything that moved. The attack lasted 4 minutes. When the Lightnings finally departed, climbing northwest toward the coast, Yamada emerged from his trench into devastation. 17. Aircraft destroyed. The runway unusable, fuel storage facilities burning, 23 men dead, another 40 wounded. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But the physical damage, severe as it was, paled beside the implications. American fighters had just struck a target Japanese planners believed was beyond their range by over 100 miles. If Hollandia was vulnerable, every airfield in New Guinea was vulnerable. The strategic calculation that had governed Japanese defensive deployments for 2 years had just been proven catastrophically wrong. What Captain Yamada didn't know, what Japanese intelligence wouldn't confirm for another 3 days, was that Hollandia was only the first target. Between dawn and noon on April 2nd, 1944, P-38, Lightnings from the 475th Fighter Group struck 12 separate Japanese airfields across a 300-mile arc of New Guinea's northern coast. Each attack followed the same pattern: sudden arrival without warning, precise bombing and strafing runs, complete withdrawal before Japanese defenders could organize response. The missions were planned and executed by Colonel Charles MacDonald, commanding the 475th Fighter Group from Dobodura. MacDonald understood something about the P-38 that German and Japanese intelligence officers consistently underestimated. Properly configured with drop tanks and flown at optimal cruise settings, the Lightning's range wasn't 450 miles. It was over 1,500 miles. That range advantage, combined with the aircraft's speed and firepower, transformed it from a fighter into a strategic weapon capable of striking targets previously thought untouchable. And on April 2nd, 1944, MacDonald demonstrated exactly what that capability meant. The story of how the P-38 achieved this impossible range begins not in New Guinea, but in Southern California, in the design offices of Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. When Clarence Kelly Johnson's team drafted the Lightning's specifications in 1937, they prioritized something unusual for a fighter aircraft: endurance. Most fighter designs of the era focused on speed, maneuverability, and climb rate. Range was secondary. Fighters operated close to their home bases, engaging enemy aircraft in relatively confined airspace. The longest mission profiles rarely exceeded 300 miles total distance. Johnson approached the problem differently. His specification called for 1 hour of flight at maximum speed and endurance, sufficient to cover strategic distances. The twin-engine configuration, combined with efficient wing design and streamlined boom nacelles, gave the P-38 exceptional aerodynamic efficiency. The Allison V-1710 engines, while less powerful than some contemporary designs, were remarkably fuel-efficient when operated at cruise settings. At 25,000 feet altitude, running at 1,600 revolutions per minute, with turbo superchargers, maintaining manifold pressure, the engines consumed approximately 70 gallons per hour combined. At that consumption rate, the P-38's internal fuel capacity of 410 gallons provided nearly 6 hours of flight time, but internal fuel was only the beginning. The Lightning's wing design incorporated mounting points for external drop tanks. Early models carried two 150-gallon tanks beneath the wings. Later variants, including the P-38J used in 1944, could mount two 165-gallon tanks plus a centerline 300-gallon tank. Total fuel capacity with full external tanks exceeded 1,000 gallons. The mathematics were straightforward. At cruise consumption of 70 gallons per hour, 1,000 gallons provided over 14 hours of flight time. At cruise speed of 210 miles per hour, that translated to theoretical range exceeding 2,900 miles. Of course, combat operations consumed fuel faster than cruise flight. Takeoff, climb to altitude, combat maneuvering, and landing reserves all reduced practical range. But even accounting for these factors, a properly planned P-38 mission could cover 1,500 miles and still have fuel for 30 minutes of combat. This capability was revolutionary. No other fighter in service in 1943 or early 1944 came close. The German Bf-109G had a combat radius of approximately 350 miles. The Japanese Zero, famous for its range, could reach about 550 miles with drop tanks. The American P-47 Thunderbolt, even with drop tanks, struggled to exceed 475 miles. The P-38 didn't just have longer range than its contemporaries. It had twice the range, 3 times in some configurations. This advantage transformed mission planning in every theater where Lightnings operated. In Europe, P-38 seconds escorted heavy bombers to targets in Germany that other fighters couldn't reach. In the Pacific, they ranged across thousands of miles of open ocean, striking islands Japanese commanders thought were safely beyond Allied reach. And in New Guinea, they made targets like Hollandia vulnerable for the first time. Colonel Charles MacDonald recognized this potential earlier than most. A meticulous planner with a background in engineering, MacDonald understood that the P-38's range advantage was only valuable if exploited systematically. Random long-range strikes might achieve tactical surprise, but systematic campaigns targeting enemy infrastructure could cripple Japanese air power across entire regions. In March 1944, MacDonald began planning what would become Operation Reckless, a coordinated series of long-range strikes against Japanese airfields throughout New Guinea. Intelligence reports indicated that 12 major airfields supported Japanese operations in the region, each hosting between 15 and 40 aircraft. Standard doctrine called for attacking such targets with medium bombers escorted by fighters, but bomber raids telegraphed their intentions. Japanese radar detected formations hundreds of miles away. Fighter controllers scrambled interceptors, anti-aircraft batteries prepared. By the time bombers arrived over target, defenses were fully alert. MacDonald proposed a different approach. Use P-38 seconds configured for long-range fighter bomber missions. Each aircraft would carry 2 1,000-pound bombs plus full ammunition for its guns. They would fly at low altitude to avoid radar detection, strike without warning, and escape before defenses could react. The missions would be timed to hit multiple airfields simultaneously, preventing Japanese commanders from reinforcing threatened bases. The plan required extraordinary precision. Navigation errors over hundreds of miles of jungle and ocean could leave formations lost with insufficient fuel to reach home. Timing had to be perfect. Arriving too early meant attacking in darkness when bombing accuracy suffered. Arriving too late gave defenders time to scramble interceptors. Most critically, the pilots had to fly at precise cruise settings for hours, resisting the temptation to increase speed. Every extra mile per hour consumed additional fuel, reducing range. The difference between mission success and running out of fuel over enemy territory came down to discipline and calculation. 5th Air Force Headquarters approved MacDonald's plan on March 28, 1944. He had 4 days to brief his pilots and finalize details. The target date was April 2nd. The objective was destruction of Japanese air power in New Guinea. The method was the impossible range of the P-38 Lightning. On the evening of April 1st, MacDonald assembled his pilots in a sweltering tent at Dobadura. He spread maps across a makeshift table, marking the 12 target airfields with red circles. The pilots studied the maps in silence. Several noted that some targets were marked over 500 miles from Dobadura. One pilot asked the obvious question. "Colonel, are we staging through a forward base?" MacDonald shook his head. "Direct strike from here. You'll carry full drop tanks and fly lean cruise settings the entire way. Navigation has to be perfect. If you get lost, you won't have fuel to search for the target." The pilots exchanged glances. What MacDonald was proposing violated every assumption about fighter operations they'd learned in training. Fighters didn't fly 500-mile missions into enemy territory without support. They didn't carry bomb loads that heavy. They didn't navigate over trackless jungle where a forced landing meant death or capture. But MacDonald had done the calculations. He'd flown test missions, timing fuel consumption at various altitudes and power settings. The numbers worked, barely, if everything went according to plan, and the payoff justified the risk. 12 airfields destroyed in a single day would cripple Japanese air operations for weeks, perhaps months. He outlined the mission profiles. Each flight would consist of 8 to 12 aircraft divided into 2 elements. The first element would suppress anti-aircraft defenses with strafing runs. The second would deliver bombs on runways, parked aircraft, and fuel storage facilities. After weapons release, both elements would strafe targets of opportunity, then withdraw at low altitude toward the coast before climbing to cruise altitude for the return flight. Takeoff was scheduled for 0430 hours, well before dawn. This timing would put formations over their targets at first light, maximizing surprise. Japanese defenders would be at their lowest alert level, aircraft parked and vulnerable, personnel still in quarters or eating breakfast. The pilots asked technical questions. What altitude for cruise? MacDonald answered, 25,000 feet outbound, 15,000 on return when you're lighter. Keep the power at 1,000, 600 revolutions per minute. Manifold pressure at 30 inches. Don't cheat the settings. Every extra 100 RPM costs you 10 miles of range. What about weather? Forecast is clear to partly cloudy. If you hit weather, maintain course. Don't climb above it. You'll burn too much fuel. Stay below 10,000 feet if necessary. What if someone has mechanical trouble? Abort immediately and return to base. Don't try to complete the mission on one engine. You won't make it. The briefing lasted 2 hours. When MacDonald dismissed the pilots, they walked out into tropical night air heavy with the sound of insects and distant surf. Some headed to their tents for a few hours of sleep. Others sat smoking cigarettes, studying maps by flashlight, calculating distances and fuel reserves. At 0415 hours on April 2nd, 1944, the first P-38 seconds began starting engines. The sound of Alison Vaughan, 1,710 seconds, echoed across Dobodura as 96 Lightnings prepared for the longest fighter missions yet attempted in the Pacific Theatre. Each aircraft carried 1,000 gallons of fuel and 2,000 pounds of bombs. Each pilot understood that the margin for error was measured in minutes of flight time. At 0430, Colonel MacDonald released the brakes on his P-38J and rolled down the pierced steel plank runway into darkness. Behind him, formation after formation followed, their navigation lights creating streams of red and green against the pre-dawn black. By 0445, all 96 aircraft were airborne, forming up over the field before turning northwest toward targets Japanese commanders believed were beyond reach. The Germans would learn the same lesson over the Mediterranean. The Japanese were learning it now over New Guinea. The P-38 Lightning's range wasn't just an advantage. It was a weapon that rewrote the strategic map. First Lieutenant Robert de Haven advanced his throttles to cruise settings as his formation leveled off at 25,000 feet over the Bismarck Sea. The sun was rising behind them now, casting long shadows across the water below. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, lay Wewak, his assigned target for this mission. De Haven led 8 P-38Js from the 7th Fighter Squadron, part of Colonel MacDonald's intricate plan to strike multiple Japanese airfields simultaneously. His formation represented just one piece of a coordinated offensive involving 96 Lightnings, attacking 12 separate targets across a 300-mile front. The mission profile was unlike anything de Haven had flown before. 2 hours and 40 minutes of cruise flight to reach Wewak, approximately 480 miles from Dobodura. 15 minutes over target for bombing and strafing runs. Then another 2 hours and 30 minutes for the return flight. Total mission time, nearly 6 hours. That assumed everything went perfectly. De Haven checked his fuel gauges. Both drop tanks reading full. Internal tanks showing 410 gallons. He was burning approximately 70 gallons per hour at current power settings, meaning his 1,000 gallons would last just over 14 hours. That seemed like plenty until you did the math. 6 hours total flight time at 70 gallons per hour meant 420 gallons consumed. Add another 50 gallons for takeoff, climb, and landing reserves. That left 530 gallons for combat operations, navigation, errors, or unexpected problems. It sounded comfortable until you considered that 10 minutes of combat maneuvering at high power could burn 50 gallons. A navigation error that added just 30 miles to the route would consume another 20 gallons. The margins were tighter than they appeared. De Haven settled into the rhythm of long-range cruise flight. Engine instruments steady. Altitude holding at 25,000 feet. Airspeed indicating 210 miles per hour. His wingmen maintained tight formation, their aircraft barely visible as dark shapes against the lightening eastern sky. Below, the Bismarck Sea stretched empty in all directions. If someone suffered engine failure out here, their options were grim. The P-38 could fly on one engine, but fuel consumption nearly doubled and range was halved. A pilot nursing a single engine back from Wewak would run out of fuel somewhere over this water, 100 miles from any land. That was assuming the remaining engine kept running. Navigation was entirely by dead reckoning. De Haven's navigator, flying in the slot position, tracked their course using compass heading, airspeed, and elapsed time. No radio navigation aids existed out here. No landmarks except occasional islands that might or might not be correctly charted. A 5-degree compass error maintained for 2 hours would put them 30 miles off course, possibly missing Wewak entirely. At 0627 hours, de Haven spotted the New Guinea coastline emerging from morning haze. His navigator confirmed their position. Right on course, right on time. They'd covered 420 miles in 2 hours and 20 minutes. Another 60 miles to Wewak. De Haven ordered the formation to descend to 5,000 feet. Lower altitude reduced visibility from the ground, and Japanese radar in this region was sporadic at best. With luck, they'd achieve complete surprise. The terrain below shifted from ocean to coastal jungle, then to foothills rising toward interior mountains. De Haven spotted the Sepik River winding, through green jungle. Navigation checkpoint confirmed. Wewak was 12 minutes ahead. At 0638 hours, his navigator called out the target. De Haven saw it immediately. A brown scar in the jungle, roughly 5,000 feet long, with aircraft parked in revetments along the edges. Wewak East Airfield, one of 4 Japanese airfields clustered around the coastal town of Wewak. No flak rose to meet them. No fighters scrambled. The base was completely unaware. De Haven split his formation as planned. 4 aircraft, including his own, would suppress defenses. 4 would deliver bombs. He pushed his throttles forward and dove toward the airfield at 300 miles per hour. The first strafing run caught Japanese ground crews in the open. Men scattered as De Haven's 4 50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon tore across the field. Tracers ripped through parked aircraft. A fuel truck exploded. Revetments disintegrated under concentrated fire. Behind De Haven, the bomber element released their 1,000-pound bombs from 1,500 feet. 8 bombs fell in a precise pattern across the runway and dispersal areas. The detonations merged into a continuous roar. Craters opened in the runway. Aircraft vanished in fireballs. De Haven pulled up and came around for a second pass. Now flak was rising. 20mm and 37mm automatic weapons firing on flat trajectory. Tracers arced toward his formation. He felt impacts, shrapnel punching through his P-38's tail booms. Warning lights flickered, but both engines kept running. The second strafing run targeted a line of parked aircraft. De Haven identified as Key 43 Oscar fighters. His guns chewed through their thin aluminum fuselages. One after another, they erupted in flames as incendiary ammunition found fuel tanks and ammunition stores. After 3 passes, De Haven checked his fuel and ordnance. Both drop tanks empty and jettisoned. Internal fuel down to 480 gallons. All ammunition expended. Time to leave. He led his formation northwest, at low altitude, weaving through valleys to avoid detection. Behind them, Wewak East was obscured by smoke from burning aircraft and fuel fires. Reconnaissance later confirmed 17 Japanese aircraft destroyed, the runway cratered in 5 locations, and fuel storage facilities completely burned out. But De Haven's strike was only one of 12 happening simultaneously across northern New Guinea. While his formation attacked Wewak, other P-38 flights were hitting Hollandia, but Dagwa, Boram, and 8 other airfields. Each attack followed the same pattern: sudden arrival, overwhelming violence, immediate withdrawal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Captain Thomas Lynch led 12 P-38 seconds against Butt Airfield, 520 miles from Dobodura. His formation arrived at 0641 hours, 3 minutes after De Haven hit Wewak. Lynch's pilots destroyed 19 Japanese aircraft on the ground and cratered the main runway in 7 locations. 2 P-38 seconds took flak damage, but both returned safely to base. Major Gerald Johnson struck Dagua with 8 lightnings at 0639 hours. His formation caught a Japanese bomber formation preparing for takeoff. Johnson's guns destroyed 5 bombers as they taxied toward the runway. His wingmen strafed parked fighters and set fire to ammunition storage buildings. Total Japanese losses: 23 aircraft destroyed. At Hollandia, where Captain Yamada had watched his airfield burn at dawn, Two separate P-38 formations struck within minutes of each other. The first attack hit at 0637 hours. The second arrived at 0642, catching Japanese personnel who'd emerged from shelters after the first attack ended. Combined, the two strikes destroyed 31 Japanese aircraft and rendered Hollandia unusable for 10 days. The coordinated timing was no accident. Colonel MacDonald had calculated each formation's flight time based on distance to target and cruise speed. He synchronized takeoffs so that all 12 attacks occurred within a 6-minute window, preventing Japanese commanders from warning outlying bases after the first strikes hit. The coordination worked perfectly. Japanese Air Defense Headquarters at Rabaul received first reports of attacks at 0639 hours. By the time they'd confirmed that multiple bases were under simultaneous attack and issued warnings, the P-38 seconds were already withdrawing. Japanese fighter units scrambled from bases that hadn't been hit, but the lightnings were long gone by the time interceptors arrived. For the P-38 pilots, the most dangerous part of the mission was still ahead, the long flight home. Combat had consumed more fuel than planned. Some pilots had made extra strafing passes. Others had run their engines at high power longer than calculated. Now they faced 450 to 550 miles of return flight with fuel reserves thinner than comfortable. De Haven climbed back to 15,000 feet and reset his engines to lean cruise. His fuel gauges showed 440 gallons remaining. He calculated 450 miles at 210 miles per hour meant 2 hours and 10 minutes flight time. At 70 gallons per hour consumption, that was 152 gallons. Add 50 gallons reserve for landing. Total, 202 gallons required. He had 440 gallons remaining. That left 238 gallons margin, comfortable, unless something went wrong. 20 minutes into the return flight, something went wrong. De Haven's No. 3 aircraft, flown by Lieutenant James Watkins, radioed that his right engine was running rough. Oil pressure was dropping. He thought he might have taken flak damage he hadn't noticed during the attack. De Haven ordered Watkins to reduce power on the damaged engine and increase power on the good engine to maintain formation speed. But running asymmetric power increased fuel consumption. Watkins reported his remaining fuel, 380 gallons. He calculated he'd reach Dobodura with less than 100 gallons remaining, assuming the damaged engine kept running. 30 minutes later, the damaged engine quit entirely. Watkins feathered the propeller and transferred fuel from the dead engine's tanks to the good engine. Now he was flying on single-engine power. Fuel consumption nearly doubled. Airspeed reduced to 180 miles per hour. De Haven made a decision. He ordered the formation to reduce speed to match Watkins' aircraft. This would increase everyone's fuel consumption, but keeping the formation together meant Watkins had navigational support and someone to call air-sea rescue if he went down over water. The math was grim. 300 miles remaining. At 180 miles per hour, that meant 1 hour and 40 minutes flight time. Watkins was burning 120 gallons per hour on one engine. That meant 200 gallons required, plus 50-gallon reserve. He had 340 gallons remaining. Theoretically, he'd make it with 90 gallons to spare. Theoretically, at 0847 hours, Watkins reported fuel down to 200 gallons with 180 miles still to go. 1 hour of flight time remaining. He was going to run out of fuel approximately 30 miles short of Dobodura, over the Solomon Sea. De Haven radioed base operations, requesting emergency rescue standby. He ordered his formation to continue reducing speed, stretching Watkins' fuel as far as possible. They were flying at 160 miles per hour now, barely above stall speed, everyone burning extra fuel to maintain formation. At 0923 hours, Watkins' engine began surging. Fuel starvation. He had less than 50 gallons remaining, perhaps 15 minutes of flight time. The coastline was visible ahead, maybe 40 miles distant. De Haven made another decision. He ordered Watkins to climb to 10,000 feet, trading fuel for altitude. If the engine quit, altitude would let him glide toward the coast, possibly reaching land before ditching. Watkins climbed. His engine quit at 9,800 feet, 28 miles from the coast. The formation circled as Watkins glided southeast in silence, except for wind noise. His P-38 covered 22 miles before he was down to 1,000 feet altitude. Still 6 miles from land, he prepared to ditch in the ocean when his surviving engine coughed, sputtered, and caught again. Somehow, fuel trapped in lines or sumps gave him 30 more seconds of power. He used it to stretch his glide, crossing the beach at 400 feet altitude. Watkins crash-landed in a jungle, clearing 2 miles inland. His P-38 cartwheeled through trees and disintegrated, but Watkins walked away with minor injuries. Australian coast watchers found him 3 hours later and transported him back to Dobodura by boat. De Haven's formation landed at 0948 hours. His own fuel gauges showed 180 gallons remaining, slightly more than calculated because he'd flown at reduced speed for the final hour. Other pilots reported remaining fuel between 150 and 210 gallons. Everyone had made it back, though Watkins' aircraft was a total loss. Across the 475th Fighter Group, the results were similar. 96 P-38 seconds had launched that morning. 94 returned to Dobodura. 1 was destroyed in Watkins's crash landing. 1 other ditched in the ocean 15 miles from base when both engines quit from fuel exhaustion. The pilot was rescued by PT boat. The operational cost: 2 aircraft lost to fuel exhaustion or battle damage. No pilots killed, 1 injured. Total mission time for most formations, between 5 hours 40 minutes and 6 hours 15 minutes. Fuel remaining on landing, 120 to 240 gallons. Against that cost, the results were staggering. Intelligence officers compiled reports from all 12 strikes over the following 48 hours. The assessment was unprecedented. Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground, 187 confirmed, another 43 probably destroyed. Runways cratered, 19 separate airfields, most rendered unusable for at least 72 hours. Fuel storage destroyed, 8 major facilities. Ammunition dumps detonated, 5. Personnel casualties, estimated over 300, Japanese killed or wounded. More importantly, Japanese air operations across northern New Guinea effectively ceased for 11 days. Fighter units that survived the attacks were forced to withdraw to bases farther north, beyond effective range for supporting ground forces. Bomber units lost so many aircraft they couldn't mount offensive operations for weeks. The strategic impact rippled across the entire theatre. Allied ground forces advancing along New Guinea's northern coast faced negligible air opposition. Supply convoys moved without fear of air attack. American bombers struck targets throughout the region with minimal fighter escort because Japanese interceptors couldn't mount effective resistance. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, sent a personal commendation to Colonel MacDonald and the 475th Fighter Group. The message was characteristically brief. Outstanding execution of an operation that demonstrates what American ingenuity, courage can achieve. But for the pilots who flew the mission, the experience left lasting impressions that had nothing to do with commendations. They'd pushed their aircraft to absolute limits, flying missions that conventional doctrine said were impossible, managing fuel with precision that left no room for error. Lieutenant De Haven later wrote in his combat diary that the 6-hour mission to Wewak was more exhausting than any dogfight he'd experienced. The stress of monitoring fuel gauges for hours, knowing that every minute of combat maneuvering consumed precious range, watching Watkins struggle home on one engine, all of it created psychological pressure, unlike conventional combat. In a dogfight, De Haven wrote, "You're either going to win or lose in 10 minutes. On a mission like Wewak, you've got 6 hours to think about every decision. 6 hours to calculate whether you have enough fuel. 6 hours, wondering if you made a navigation error that's going to leave you ditching in the ocean. That kind of stress accumulates." Other pilots echoed similar sentiments. The long-range strikes required different skills than traditional fighter missions. Navigation had to be perfect. Fuel management had to be precise. Discipline had to be absolute, no hot-dogging, no extra combat passes, no deviation from planned cruise settings. These requirements favored experienced pilots who could suppress their instincts and fly by calculation. Younger pilots, aggressive and confident, sometimes struggled with the patience required for 6-hour missions, where most of the time was spent simply monitoring instruments. The success of the April 2nd strikes led to immediate tactical changes across the Pacific Theater. 5th Air Force Headquarters authorized regular long-range P-38 missions against Japanese airfields throughout New Guinea, New Britain, and eventually the Philippines. The Lightning's range advantage was now recognized not as an interesting capability, but as a strategic weapon. German intelligence officers, tracking American operations from Europe, noted the New Guinea strikes with alarm. Their own Bf-110 twin-engine fighters had maximum range of approximately 650 miles. The idea that American twin-engine fighters could fly operational missions exceeding 1,000 miles challenged fundamental assumptions about what fighters could achieve. Luftwaffe strategic analysts compiled reports examining how the P-38 achieved such range. They identified several factors: efficient aerodynamics, fuel-efficient engines at cruise settings, extensive use of drop tanks, and meticulous mission planning that optimized every variable. But recognizing how the Americans did, it didn't help German forces counter it. By 1944, Germany lacked resources to develop competing long-range fighters. Japanese intelligence reached similar conclusions. Their assessment, captured in documents recovered after the war, acknowledged that the P-38's range capability had rendered much of defensive strategy obsolete. Airfields they'd believed were safely beyond Allied reach were now vulnerable. This forced redeployment of fighter units farther from front lines, reducing their effectiveness while increasing strain on already limited fuel supplies. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was equally significant. The knowledge that American fighters could appear anywhere, at any time, without warning created constant uncertainty. Pilots returning from missions never knew if their home base would still be operational. Ground crews worked under persistent tension, aware that destruction could arrive with less than 1 minute's warning. For the P-38 pilots, April 2nd, 1944 became a defining moment. They'd proven that twin-engine fighters, properly employed, could achieve mission profiles impossible for single-engine aircraft. They'd demonstrated that range was a weapon as potent as speed or firepower, and they'd shown that American aviation engineering had produced something genuinely revolutionary. The mission also validated Kelly Johnson's original design philosophy. When Johnson sketched the P-38's twin-boom configuration in 1937, he'd prioritized endurance alongside performance. 7 years later, that decision was destroying Japanese air power across thousands of miles of Pacific territory. The strategic implications of the April 2nd raids extended far beyond the immediate destruction of Japanese aircraft. What Colonel MacDonald and his pilots had demonstrated was that air superiority could be achieved not just through superior numbers or better aircraft, but through the ability to strike anywhere at will. This capability, the power to make any enemy position vulnerable, transformed aerial warfare in ways German and Japanese commanders struggled to counter. Traditional defensive strategies assumed that rear area bases were secure. Fighters deployed forward, where combat occurred. Support, infrastructure, maintenance facilities, fuel, storage, ammunition depots concentrated at bases beyond enemy fighter range. These rear area positions didn't require heavy defenses because the enemy couldn't reach them. The P-38's range demolished that assumption. By May 1944, Japanese forces throughout the Pacific were operating under new defensive protocols. No airfield was considered secure. Fighter strength could no longer be concentrated entirely at forward positions. Reserves had to be maintained at rear bases to defend against long-range strikes. Fuel and ammunition could no longer be stored in large, centralized dumps. Supplies had to be dispersed across multiple locations, reducing efficiency. These changes consumed resources Japan couldn't afford to waste. Every fighter assigned to rear area defense was one fewer fighter available to contest Allied advances. Every hour spent dispersing supplies was one fewer hour available for offensive operations. The P-38's range advantage forced Japanese commanders to fight defensively, reacting to American initiatives rather than executing their own strategies. German forces in Europe faced similar challenges. While the European theatre involved shorter distances than the Pacific, P-38 Lightnings escorting heavy bombers could now reach targets throughout Germany. Luftwaffe commanders who'd built defensive strategy around the assumption that American escorts would turn back at specific points suddenly had to defend targets they'd considered beyond fighter escort range. Major Johannes Steinhoff, commanding JG 77 inches Italy during 1943–44, later wrote extensively about the psychological impact of the P-38's range. German pilots, he noted, had grown accustomed to American bomber formations losing their fighter escorts at predictable points. Luftwaffe fighters would wait for the escorts to depart, then attack the now vulnerable bombers. When the P-38 seconds began appearing deeper and deeper into German airspace, Steinhoff wrote, "We realized our fundamental raid strategy was collapsing. We could no longer wait for escorts to leave because they weren't leaving. We had to engage through the entire mission profile, which meant accepting losses we'd previously avoided." The data supported Steinhoff's assessment. Luftwaffe fighter losses over Germany increased dramatically in early 1944 as P-38 seconds and other long-range escorts began flying deep penetration missions. German fighters that might have achieved favorable exchange ratios against unescorted bombers now faced continuous combat from the moment bombers crossed into German airspace until they departed. The cumulative attrition proved unsustainable. Statistical analysis conducted by U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey after the war revealed the mathematical reality behind these operational changes. In the 6 months before long-range fighter escorts became routine, July through December 1943, the 8th Air Force lost an average of 5.3 bombers per 100 sorties. Fighter losses during the same period averaged 1.1 aircraft per 100 sorties. In the 6 months after long-range escorts became standard, January through June 1944, bomber losses dropped to 3.7 per 100 sorties, a 30% reduction. Fighter losses increased to 1.8 per 100 sorties, a 64% increase, but the fighters were far less expensive to replace than heavy bombers, and pilot survival rates were higher. Most significantly, the bombing campaign's effectiveness increased dramatically. When bombers didn't have to fight through overwhelming fighter opposition for the entire mission, they could focus on bombing accuracy. Maintenance requirements decreased because aircraft weren't returning shot full of holes. Crew morale improved because survival odds increased. The strategic calculus was clear. Long-range fighter escorts, particularly P-38 seconds that could fly farther than any other Allied fighter, had made precision daylight bombing viable. What had seemed like a failing strategy in 1943 became the foundation of Allied air supremacy in 1944. But the true measure of the P-38's range advantage wasn't just statistical, it was operational. The aircraft enabled missions that were literally impossible with any other fighter. The most famous example remains the Yamamoto mission of April 18, 1943. But that operation represented only one instance of a capability the P-38 demonstrated repeatedly. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Lightning units flew hundreds of long-range missions that rewrote tactical possibilities. In Europe, P-38 seconds based in North Africa flew escort missions into southern Germany, covering distances that required nearly 7 hours of flight time. In the Pacific, P-38 seconds flew from Guadalcanal to Rabaul and back, an 1,100-mile round trip that left single-engine fighters tied to bases far closer to combat zones. In the China-Burma-India theatre, P-38 seconds ranged across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, knowing that a forced landing in the Himalayas or Burmese jungle meant almost certain death. Lieutenant Colonel Clay Tice, commanding the 459th Fighter Squadron in the CBI theatre, flew 97 P-38 missions between March 1944 and August 1945. His combat diary documents dozens of missions exceeding 1,200 miles total distance. One entry from June 1944 describes a mission to Bangkok, Thailand, 780 miles from his base in India. "We carried full drop tanks," Tice wrote, "and flew at 25,000 feet where the Allisons ran most efficiently. 6 hours and 40 minutes total mission time. We hit a Japanese supply depot and destroyed approximately 40 trucks. On the way home, my wingman's left engine quit. We thought he'd have to bail out over the jungle, but he made it back on one engine, landed with 17 gallons of fuel remaining. That's the margin we worked with, sometimes enough, sometimes not quite." That last line, "sometimes enough, sometimes not quite," encapsulated the reality of long-range P-38 operations. The aircraft's range was extraordinary, but it wasn't infinite. Pilots who pushed too far, who misjudged fuel consumption, who encountered unexpected headwinds or got lost, ran out of options. Records indicate that approximately 140 P-38 seconds were lost in the Pacific theater to fuel exhaustion, roughly 8% of all Pacific P-38 losses. That percentage might seem small, but it represented nearly 1,000 pilots who either died ditching in the ocean or survived only through remarkable luck and rescue operations. The fuel management challenge created a unique culture among P-38 pilots. They became obsessive about calculating range, tracking consumption, planning routes that maximized efficiency. Navigation was treated as sacred errors could be fatal. Weather planning was critical. Headwinds could turn a marginal mission into a disaster. This culture of precision and planning distinguished P-38 units from single-engine fighter squadrons. P-51 and P-47 pilots could afford to be more cavalier about fuel management because their missions rarely pushed aircraft to absolute range limits. P-38 pilots couldn't afford that attitude. Every mission required the same careful calculation, the same disciplined execution. Major Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 kills, exemplified this mindset. Bong's combat reports are filled with fuel calculations, range planning, and detailed navigation logs. He treated each mission as an engineering problem, requiring mathematical solution. His aggressive combat tactics, closing to point-blank range before firing, were enabled by his conservative mission planning. He had fuel for combat because he never wasted fuel getting to or from the combat zone. Compare this to German aces like Erich Hartmann or Gerhard Barkhorn, whose combat reports focused almost exclusively on tactics and kills. Fuel management rarely appeared in their accounts because their Bf 109 seconds operated close to home bases. They could afford to focus entirely on fighting because they never had to worry about having enough fuel to reach home. This difference in operational mindset reflected broader strategic realities. Germany fought a defensive war in its own airspace. The Luftwaffe could concentrate forces at threatened points and operate close to supply lines. American forces fought an offensive war across vast distances. They had to project power thousands of miles from home bases, and that required aircraft with range to match ambitions. The P-38 provided that range, and in doing so, it enabled a strategic approach that Germany and Japan simply couldn't counter. The Allies could strike anywhere. The Axis could only react. In warfare, the side that chooses when and where to fight holds overwhelming advantage. By late 1944, this advantage was producing decisive results across all theatres. In Europe, Luftwaffe fighter strength was collapsing under sustained attrition. In the Pacific, Japanese air power was being systematically destroyed. In both regions, long-range P-38 operations contributed significantly to enemy decline. Post-war analysis by military historians consistently identifies air superiority as the single most important factor in Allied victory. And air superiority was achieved not just through superior numbers, though the Allies did outnumber Axis forces, but through superior capability to operate at strategic distances. The P-38's maximum range of 1,500 plus miles with drop tanks far exceeded anything in German or Japanese inventory. This gap in capability created asymmetric advantages that compounded over time. Every long-range mission that destroyed enemy aircraft on the ground was a battle won without American losses. Every escort mission that protected bombers deep into enemy territory was a strategic blow the enemy couldn't prevent. German aviation engineers understood what they were seeing. Captured documents reveal intense efforts in 1944 to develop long-range escort fighters that could counter Allied capabilities. The Ta-152, VU-190D, and various Bf-109 variants all incorporated fuel capacity increases and efficiency improvements, but these efforts came too late. Germany lacked time, resources, and operational breathing space to field new aircraft in sufficient numbers. The Reich's aviation industry was under constant bombardment. Fuel supplies were critically short. Pilot training programs couldn't replace losses. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively a spent force. Japan faced even worse circumstances. American submarines had strangled Japanese fuel supplies. Experienced pilots were dead, replaced by undertrained replacements with minimal flight hours. Aircraft production, while still substantial, couldn't match losses. And American long-range fighters, primarily P-38 seconds, ranged across every remaining Japanese airbase from New Guinea to the Philippines to Formosa, destroying aircraft faster than Japan could replace them. The strategic picture was clear by spring 1945. The Allies owned the skies. They could strike any target, support any ground operation, interdict any supply line. The Axis powers could only endure, and the foundation of that aerial dominance was the ability to operate at strategic distances that made enemy positions untenable. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin booms, twin engines, and extraordinary endurance, exemplified this capability more than any other aircraft. When German and Japanese intelligence officers first assessed the P-38 inches 1,942, they calculated its range at approximately 450 miles and dismissed it as useful only for local operations. This assessment, based on conservative assumptions about fuel management and combat overhead, seemed reasonable. What they failed to anticipate was that American pilots would learn to extract every possible mile from their aircraft through disciplined cruise control, optimal altitude selection, and meticulous planning. What they failed to appreciate was that American aviation engineers had designed the P-38 with endurance as a primary requirement, creating an aircraft that, properly flown, could operate at distances impossible for any contemporary fighter. By the time German and Japanese commanders realized their error, they faced American fighters operating with impunity across vast regions they'd thought secure. The bomber formations they'd hoped to destroy after escorts turned back for fuel now maintained fighter protection all the way to targets and home again. The rear area air bases they'd built beyond enemy reach were burning, destroyed by formations that appeared without warning and vanished before defenses could respond. The strategic lesson was profound but simple. In modern warfare, range is power. The nation that can project force farther than its enemies can choose when, where, and how to fight. That choice, consistently exploited, produces cumulative advantages that compound into strategic dominance. The P-38 Lightning gave the United States that advantage. Its twin engines, initially mocked as a weakness by German pilots accustomed to nimble single-engine fighters, provided the power and redundancy necessary for missions exceeding 1,500 miles. Its efficient design, optimized for endurance rather than just speed, extracted maximum range from available fuel. Its reliability, demonstrated across thousands of long-range missions, gave pilots confidence to push operational limits. Colonel Charles MacDonald, who planned the 12 Airfield raid, continued flying P-38 seconds until war's end. He completed 169 combat missions and scored 27 confirmed kills, making him the third-ranking American ace in the Pacific. After the war, he wrote extensively about the Lightning's capabilities. People focus on kills. MacDonald said in a 1956 interview. But the P-38's real achievement wasn't just shooting down enemy aircraft, it was making the entire Pacific theater accessible. Before the Lightning, huge areas were beyond our operational reach. Japanese forces operated with impunity from bases we couldn't touch. The P-38 changed that. Suddenly, nowhere was safe. Every Japanese airfield, every supply dump, every staging area was vulnerable. That psychological pressure, that knowledge that we could strike anywhere at any time, was worth more than any number of aerial victories. MacDonald's assessment, delivered 11 years after war's end, captured what contemporary German and Japanese commanders had learned through painful experience. The P-38's range wasn't just a technical specification. It was a strategic capability that redefined what was possible in aerial warfare. When Captain Takeo Yamada stood at Hollandia on April 2nd, 1944, watching bombs fall from aircraft that shouldn't have been able to reach his base, he witnessed the future of military aviation. Range, endurance, and operational reach would define air power for the next century. The nation that could project force farther, sustain operations longer, and strike with less warning would dominate. The P-38 Lightning was the first fighter to fully embody this principle. Its twin engines, its unconventional design, its extraordinary range, all the characteristics that made German and Japanese observers initially skeptical, proved to be precisely what made the aircraft revolutionary. They couldn't believe one P-38 could fly 1,500 miles non-stop. Then they watched as formations of Lightnings destroyed 12 airfields in a single day, operating at distances that rendered traditional defensive strategies obsolete. The lesson was clear, painful, and decisive. Never underestimate an enemy whose reach exceeds your ability to defend. The Americans had built an aircraft with impossible range, and that impossible range won the war. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.